Good afternoon, and thanks again for joining. It's Michelle Savage here with XBRL US, and you are here for our session, A 30,000-Foot View of Inline XBRL, What's New, What's Not. This is the first in a series that we're holding on Inline XBRL, and we'll tell you a little bit about the upcoming programs at the end of this one. So I just want to cover a couple of logistical points before we get started. First, if you have any kind of technical difficulties, please email us at support, SUPPORT, at xbrl.us, and we'll get you back online again. Second, we are offering CPE credit for the program today, and if you have opted to receive CPE credit, please make sure that you respond to the poll questions, which will be given at 2 points during the program today. And then you'll get your certificate in the next couple of weeks emailed to you. And finally, I wanted to mention that we are taking questions through the program. And if you have questions, please click on the Q&A link that you see on the screen and submit your question. And we'll do our best to get to all the questions. We do have a lot to cover today, though, I will say. So now let's go to our next slide, which covers our agenda. And I just wanted to introduce you to our speakers today. We have Joe Luchka. Joe is director at KPMG, and Joe's going to be telling us a little bit more about the rule, and he'll talk about components of the SEC submission, and he will touch on the workflow changes that you're going to be encountering as you move into Inline XBRL. Our second speaker is Brian Castrantis. Brian is senior manager at Ritchie May & Company. Brian is going to be giving details on the XBRL instance document and taxonomy, and he'll talk a little bit about managing quality. So I think we have a really good program for you all today, and let's go ahead and get started. And I'll turn it over to Joe, I'm sorry, to get started.
Thank you, Michelle. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. Brian and I are very glad to be here today to walk you through some of the high-level understanding and overview of the rule for Inline XBRL. As we go through the next 50 minutes or so and kind of talk to you a little bit about Inline and what it means to you as a filer as you go through the conversion process and how it will change your lives going forward, I'm going to talk a little bit about some key points in the rule and then talk a little bit conceptually about what Inline means and how it's going to kind of change the process by which you go through your instance document creation and review. And then Brian's going to kind of highlight some of the key differences between the traditional XBRL that many companies file with today and the new Inline version, particularly as it relates to some things that will change in your instance document and some things that you may need to consider as you're going through and reviewing. So with that, let's start off with the single most important question that we believe is, when will this impact me? When will I have to change? According to the SEC rule, the large accelerated filers will start with their first fiscal period ending on or after June 15th of 2019, followed by accelerated filers in the same time frame in 2020, and all other filers in 2021. Now, regardless of phase, all filers will comply beginning with their first 10Q. So if you happen to be a 6/30 year end or thereabouts and you file a case shortly thereafter, you would be adopting this later in your September quarter. So that gives you a little bit of extra time. It's always good to start with a Q, and we're grateful that the SEC has given us that opportunity to kind of take a smaller bite at the apple and to make sure that we get it right and that we can go through the process on a smaller, simpler Q. What are some of the requirements of the new rule? Well, other than switching to Inline, there are not a lot. For operating companies, there are no changes to the timing of the submission, but it is important to understand that this also applies to mutual funds and their filings. It does eliminate the current 15 business day period accorded to all mutual fund filings containing risk return summaries. I do encourage you, if you are getting into some special things, for example, perhaps some initial registration statements, to read the rule to really understand what some of those requirements are. There are a couple nuances there. We're not going to go through every single one of them today as they impact a smaller population, but I do encourage you to read the rule just so you have an understanding of that in addition to what we cover here today in the slides. So we've heard it now for a while that Inline is better, that Inline is going to revolutionize XBRL and that it's going to make things better for consumers of the data and users of the data. So let's talk a little bit conceptually. And I have to say that some of the thoughts that I might have on these slides are my thoughts given from discussions with filers that have currently switched to the inline model. Some of those who still are on traditional, and some of their reasons for staying with, traditional up until they have to change. But there are lots of different viewpoints, and it really does depend on how you've integrated XBRL into your financial reporting process. It's less about the technology and more about the process by which you're generating your financial statements. So, the initial thought is that inline documents should have a higher data quality because you can actually see it in the same format as your financial statements. Well, there's some truth to that. Overall, I would say that a separate XBRL exhibit may increase the likelihood of inconsistent data, particularly as you get down to the wire and you're trying to file and you make a change to your HTML financials and you've got to rush that change into your XBRL exhibit and make sure the two are still consistent and reflect the same data points. That's been a pain point for some companies, particularly those that make last-minute changes before their filing date. Well, having one inline docket should ensure that that data is more consistent and more reliable. We've also dealt with the time-tested or the time-painful model of the rendering model, and the fact that some filers may include additional or unnecessary tags in order to try and make things look the same, as opposed to dealing with the data and the structure of the data itself. Inline should do away with that because it should be more accurate or more consistent with the historical paper presentation. As you go forward, you'll have one document, an XHTML document, that will be your printed or your visual document that you would see on a screen or a PDF or, in some online service that would have the XBRL data embedded into it. So we've kind of gone through a couple of years now with the XBRL viewer that was published by the SEC. So I'm assuming that many of you have had an opportunity to look at an inline document and to see that it does have a more accurate or truer representation of your paper financials, and that those values that are tagged will be underlined. And by hovering the mouse over them, you'll be able to see the tagging that's underneath that. Now, Brian in his slides later on will bring up a couple of points of when the inline model is a little bit clearer to help you understand what's there. And in some cases, it might mask a little bit, and you might want to still consider traditional views of the inline data. But in an effort to make things clearer to individuals, the inline view does seem to be a lot better than the rendering model we've had in the past. Inline would also give a preparer better control over the presentation of the disclosures because, again, it is more consistent between the two versions and a little bit easier to simply take what you have, highlight the values, attach your tags, and move on to the next section. So in general, we've got the thought process out there that inline documents may be visually easier to digest, may have a higher data quality because it more accurately presents your financials. Now, I will tell you that there are some certain differences, some things that are going to change with an inline document, and Brian's going to go through those when he talks about hidden tags and some of the other changes you may need to incorporate. The other perception is that inline will reduce the cost. It will do something to eliminate the cost because it's going to eliminate the need to create a separate document. I know I've spent several years doing agreed upon procedures for some of our audit clients here, and one of the complaints was always that we have two separate documents. We have to make sure that they're consistent, and every time we make a change, we have to change it in the other one, and it does take some review power to get those consistent and accurate. Having one document should help with this process. It also should help reduce the review time spent by management as they're going through to make sure that all of their changes get reflected. Now, one of the things that I will mention here is that there is a perception that inline will increase the use of XBRL tag data. We're not really sure if that's a true statement or not. We do think that it will make it easier for companies to comply with the rules for XBRL tagging of their financial statement data. And we do believe that the use of inline XBRL should make the process a little bit simpler and easier to comply with. However, consumers of the data, typically don't get their data from an inline document. They either get it from the SEC website, where it could be downloaded, or through an RSS feed. More likely, they get it through data aggregators who are starting to use the XBRL data and have actually made great strides in the last couple of years and incorporating XBRL into their product offerings, so that when individuals or companies choose to purchase data from them, they can get a full suite of a lot more data points than were previously available because of the XBRL tagging at a lower cost. So data aggregators will tend to benefit from this. I'm not so sure, and this is open for discussion. They may disagree with me that Inline will make it easier. But I think data aggregators have gone a long way in the last couple of years to utilize XBRL data. And of course, data feeds. So moving on to the next, the second key thing, and what I've talked to a lot of companies about, is they contemplate the decision of, what do I need to consider as I'm moving to inline XBRL? One of the common questions that I have is, my vendor is telling me that I need to move to this right away because it's the best thing. Should I do that? When is the right time to move? Well, that's a very philosophical question, and it depends on every organization. Moving to inline for the sake of inline, could be a very good thing, but it also depends on your organization, when you're ready for that change, when you can devote the time to carry out that change effectively and accurately, and understanding how it kind of fits into your overall process. Should you do it now? Should you put it off a little bit? And also, think about, changing models. Should you think about changing your software or your vendor? There's a lot of things to consider. With this particular slide, I'm going to touch on a couple of those to give you some things to think about. I don't necessarily have the right answer in every case, but what I would like to tell you is that, think about your organization, the people involved, the resources that you have, and that should kind of drive, your change in addition to the requirements of the rule. So first off, is this a revolutionary change or is this an evolutionary change? Well, it kind of depends on what you're doing now. Depending on the vendor you have and the software you use to tag your financial statements, you may have a disclosure management software tool. And I sometimes look at this as one of the integrated tools where you can do your HTML, your XBRL tagging, and maybe other management type reporting all in one particular tool that allows you to eliminate some of the retagging or re-input of data. And if you're moving from a disclosure management software tool to inline, you're probably not going to notice a whole lot of change. The software tool is going to kind of insulate you from some of the real changes. You will have to make some of the changes that Brian is going to talk to you about in the second half of this webinar today. However, for the most part, what I've been told, and I've only done this, to a small amount because I'm more on the audit side than I'm on the implementation side, the disclosure management software tool does make it a lot easier for you to move to that. Now, there are some, percentage of the population that still might be using a standalone XBRL tagging application. We typically used to call that the bolt-on approach, where you first develop your financial statements in another tool, and then you tag them in one of these applications, and you end up having the two separate documents. For those of you still on a tagging application, it might be more of an effort to move to one of these new disclosure management software tools that does the inline as part of its basic functionality. However, there's good times to move and there's bad times to move. And hopefully if it's, one of your quarters and you're doing a queue, you can make the time and the effort available and the resources available to ensure a smooth transition to an application that supports inline. There's no one right answer. There's no one right tool. I know that, there's lots of thoughts out there in the marketplace, but really integration with your current systems and your current processes, should drive some of this. I do have, a lot of conversations with teams, and they're like, to some extent to us, moving from traditional to inline really wasn't that big of an effort because our vendor did a lot of the heavy lifting for us and they did a lot of the changes that we needed to. So we were somewhat, insulated from that. And that's a very true statement, and that's very helpful. And I know that I've heard that, a lot of vendors have made it easy to move to inline because we do see it as the way of the future. Now, the question is, when should I start this process and how long will it take? I don't have a right answer for you on that. A lot of it, again, will depend on your resources available. Do you have the time to review the changes that need to be made? Are you moving from a DMS or a standalone application? So for everybody, it's going to be a little bit different. It also may vary as to how much effort or how much assistance you're going to request from your vendor and how much you choose to do yourself. Whether you have your vendor help you transition or you choose to do it yourself, again, I'm sorry, I apologize, I'll put on my auditor hat. The ultimate responsibility does rest with the filer for the accuracy and the choices that are made during the tagging process. So, that process should be overseen and supervised by an individual within the filer who has sufficient knowledge of XBRL to understand the changes that are being made. And at the end of this, we'll talk about some of the other webinars that we have available to help you with this that are kind of a deeper dive into some of the technical requirements, a deeper dive into some of the applications, into some of the process changes. So, so keep in mind some of those that will help you through this process and understand, the steps you need to take. What are some of the conversations that you can have with your service providers? Well, there's a couple new attributes that are going to be required. Well, who's responsible for, establishing those initial values? Is that something that, the vendor has best practices and they're simply going to do it for me? Is that something that I need to review that, that attribute or those settings for all of the new tags that we create or for all of the existing tags that are going to get migrated? Again, a little bit of it depends on your vendor and the software that you're using and what you're going to be implementing going forward. What changes will I need to make to my current tagging? There are a few that we're going to talk about. I think one of the kind of the more impactful ones are things like hidden tags, and we'll get into that a little bit. It may change some of what how you choose to disclose something in your filing. It really shouldn't. XBRL should not change your disclosures. It should merely complement your disclosures. But there may be some times where you may choose to word something differently or present it slightly differently in order to make the tagging a little bit easier. What reporting or documentation will I need? What will my vendor provide? Again, I'll put my auditor hat on. I would lean towards having, sufficient documentation so that you understand what changes were made, when they were made, and why they were made, so that if a question comes up in the future, a year from now or 2 years from now, why did we choose this tag? Or why did we model the table this particular way? Or what did we do, when we moved to inline with these particular data types or tag types? I understand we changed the tag type here. Why did we do that? While it's fresh in your mind, I would encourage you to document some of that. And we're not, looking for, a complete rewrite of everything that you've got, but to the extent that there are certain key considerations of inline, how did you address them? What did you do for them? And then how did you check that after the transition, those considerations were appropriate? Do I need to train my people to do anything different? Again, it's going to depend on the tool that you're moving from to what you're going to. Many of you may choose to stay with the same vendor, in which case, it should be a relatively simple transition. Understanding some of the differences between traditional and inline may be sufficient. Understanding, how do I review? And it may be that you've done all of your review in the vendor software tool for the last several years, and you're comfortable with that. And you can continue to do that, but there may be some additional, nuances that you've got to check and make sure are working correctly. Again, I'll pick on hidden tags because they're one of the harder ones to notice. How am I going to deal with signs? Do I consider signs the same way? Do I look at them differently? Again, it's going to be somewhat tool specific. And then in my review process, are there things that I'm going to want to do differently? Well, there may be, and we can talk about this. And can I review solely in my tool? Are there certain areas where it's just easier to look at in either a different tool or maybe the XBRL viewer provided by the SEC? Things like tables. Are there different ways to look at dimensional axes and the members that are applied to them? I can't give you one silver bullet that will make it the easiest scenario for you. It's really going to depend on your particular financials, whether you've got a lot of tables, whether you've got a lot of narrative text with individual numbers. There's a lot of different scenarios. Sit down and talk to your vendor. What other functionality is available? Should I be exporting some of this to Excel and then looking at it in Excel or maybe some other tool? Do I want to, perhaps think about buying a third tool so that I can, have my choice of my vendor provided software, my XBRL or inline enabled viewer from the SEC, and possibly something else to kind of help me just have that additional comfort. Again, it's going to be company specific with your particular footnotes and your particular tables versus narrative and how those footnotes are assembled. What's going to change in a quarterly review process? Again, we don't anticipate that there's a huge amount. You're going to have the same overall requirements, to have an understanding of the key risk points in your XBRL tagged financials, to understand what could go wrong in XBRL, things like signs or perhaps attributes or perhaps members. Understanding, in your software, how should something be presented so that it presents correctly when viewed by a third party using either a browser or their consumption software. So there may not be a lot of changes, but as part of your process of implementation, start thinking about that. And are there opportunities for us to streamline our process? Are there opportunities to make our process more accurate when we review, the first quarter under Inline? One of the thoughts is that Inline should make things a little bit easier because you don't have the rendering to deal with. So one of my first questions that I ask most people, if you save time by not having the rendering and you now have free time, are there other things that you might want to look at in the XBRL? Or is this simply newfound time that you can then focus on other parts of your close process? There may be some things that maybe, you never quite paid enough attention to in the past with your XBRL review because you were so focused on, is everything tagged? Is everything there from a completeness standpoint? This may free up some time to help you better focus on some of your riskier footnotes. And with that, those are some of the, if you want to call it, the high level conceptual thoughts that I would throw out there. With that, we're going to go to the next slide. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to let Brian share his. And he's going to walk you through some of the more technical features of Inline and how it compares to XBRL. And with that, I'm going to click stop share here and Brian's going to take over.
All right, thank you, Joe. So next, we're going to talk about a couple of the specific features, to an iXBRL document versus an XBRL document, and go into some detail about the changes that Joe mentioned previously. So what has changed? The big change is that an instance document is no longer required to be submitted as a separate document. The iXBRL tags are actually embedded within the HTML, so you no longer have to create that separate file. The good thing is that the traditional instance document can still be extracted out of the iXBRL data. And if you were to look at an iXBRL filing on the SEC's website, you would see the iXBRL document at the top, and in the lower section for the interactive data, you would see that extracted instance document. So there's some backwards compatibility there that you can still compare the traditional instance document to what you're used to seeing. The other thing that's new is the iXBRL viewer available from the SEC. You're going to see a couple of screenshots demonstrating some of the new functions and capabilities that are built into that tool. And as Joe mentioned, the website posting requirement has been eliminated, so you no longer have to post your XBRL files to your website as you did under the previous rule.
Brian, it's Michelle here. You need to share your screen.
Oh, is it not showing up?
Great, there you
Thanks,
go.
Michelle.
Thank you.
All right, so apologies for that. This was the slide that we were just talking about with those changes. So moving on, what stays the same? Pretty much everything else stays the same. As Joe had mentioned, for a number of the filers that he spoke to, it was pretty much a non-event for them. You're still going to use the same company-specific extension taxonomy. You still have all the same requirements around the presentation link base and the label requirements. You still need to have captions that match your financial statements. And you should still be following the company-specific element definition should still conform to the FASB's style guide. Also, the calculation requirements are still in effect. So anywhere that you have footed totals, you're still required to define those calculation relationships within your XBRL document. So as far as some best practices for managing some of these changes, as Joe had mentioned earlier, discuss your timeline and approach with your vendor prior to your filing deadline. If you're going to have to transition here during Q2, you probably want to start those conversations here towards the end of Q1, and maybe even consider filing ahead of time under the voluntary order, which is certainly permissible. But also having a backup plan in the event that you're not able to complete the iXBRL document. You should also talk to your vendor about the tools that are available and understand those process changes that might need to be implemented. We'll talk about a few of those momentarily. And consider the use of the iXBRL render in your review process. There are certain places where the iXBRL render helps tremendously with being able to assess the completeness and accuracy of your filing. And there's some other areas where what you've been doing with the traditional XBRL file might be a more preferable methodology to go and review your filing. Another thing you might consider doing, since you do have the availability to generate that extracted XBRL instance, is once you have your new filing ready under iXBRL, is extract that instance and compare it to what you filed last quarter to understand what significant changes are there. Did we potentially lose some tags? Do we have fewer tags than before? But it might be a good exercise just to understand what changes are occurring between XBRL and iXBRL. So next, we're going to talk about some of these specific features. The hidden tags that Joe had mentioned earlier is a new concept that wasn't part of traditional XBRL. And what a hidden tag allows you to do is it allows you to include information in your filing that either doesn't have a corresponding label or anything to actually tie to in your source document, or that there's not a transformation available for, which we'll talk about transformations in a little bit here. A good example of this would be your CIK code. If you filed in XBRL before, you know that you're required to include your CIK code in the document and entity information section. But the CIK code never appears anywhere on the face of your document. So this is a perfect example of a situation where there's nothing physically in the document for you to tag that CIK code to. You would embed that into the hidden section of your filing. You should only be using the hidden section for those situations where you either don't have something physically to tie it to in the document, or there isn't a transformation available. You don't want to use it to intentionally hide information that should appear in the filing. You also don't want to include information that isn't in the filing unless it is required by the XBRL specific or the SEC's rules. And the last one is, just don't tag information that could otherwise be tagged without using the hidden section. So if there is a value in there and there's a transformation that exists, don't use it unnecessarily. So here's an example of what a hidden tag would look like and how you would find them using the SEC's iXBRL viewer. What you would do is you click on the more filters at the top, and there's a data filter there for additional items only, and these are the hidden items. As you can see, the CIK code doesn't appear anywhere on the face of the financial statement, but it's included here within the hidden section. The other example is the MC restaurant registrant name. As you can see, it's slightly different. It's Lennar Corp New in the XBRL data, which is slightly different than what exists on the face of the cover page. So that's a situation where there's not a transformation available, and the company elected to use the hidden tag section to include both of these data points. So what are some best practices? Just a recap of what was said before. You only want to include required XBRL data points that don't have corresponding text, or include data points that do not have transformations. What we recommend is develop a process. You can use that functionality that's built into the XBRL viewer on the SEC's website, or you can speak to your service provider about how they can show that information to you. There should be a way for them to expose just what the hidden tags are so that you can review those and make sure you've documented the reason for why they're there. The next topic we're going to cover here is duplicate amounts. So duplicate amounts have been around for a while. These are one of the potential items that could get your XBRL filing stripped or rejected by the SEC. There's a couple of different types of them. But in general, what a duplicate fact is when you have two or more facts that provide the same piece of information. And there's three different types that it can either be an exact match, which we call a exact duplicate. We can have a consistent duplicate, which would be two items that are at varying levels of precision throughout the document, or what we call an inconsistent one. And these are the ones you don't want to have in your filing that will get your filing rejected. So when are you allowed to use duplicate amounts? Really, the only situation is when you have those consistent or exact duplicates. Those are perfectly acceptable, and it's recommended that you tag all values regardless of their precision within the filing. What you don't want to do is include duplicate facts when the values are inconsistent as defined. This will automatically get your filing rejected. So here's an example of what we would call a consistent or acceptable duplicate, which you can see here in this set of financial statements is we have derivative assets of $43,725,000,000. Later on in the financial statements, we see that number again, except we see it at a lower level of precision, a rounded amount of 43.7 billion. So these values are tagged with, for the same period with two different amounts for the same tag. But when you consider the precision, they're considered consistent duplicates and they represent the same value. So this would be permissible under the current rules. Unfortunately, I can't really show you an inconsistent duplicate because if somebody tried to submit a filing with an inconsistent duplicate, it would be rejected and you would get an error from the SEC similar to this, that you have an inconsistent duplicate. You stated two completely unique values for the same concept. All right, and now I'm going to turn it over to Michelle for some CPE questions.
Great, thanks very much. And I'm gonna share my screen, but while I'm doing that, we do have a number of questions that have come in, and I'm gonna be pulling up our poll questions for CPE credit. So let me just ask a few of these questions that we've received. Let's see. The first question we got was, and I think this is kind of for Joe, or I'm sure for Brian too. If we are a 12/31 year end and a large accelerated filer, are we required to switch to inline XBRL by our Q2 2019 10Q at the latest?
So if you were a large accelerated filer, your first Q due after June 15th, 2019. So that would be your June 30th, 2019 filing would need to have inline XBRL.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question came up. The final inline XBRL and existing XBRL does not require audit review of the tag data, only the HTML financials. Since with inline, the disclosure will be in one merged HTML file set, do you think the inline should be audited or that the SEC may advocate for that?
Ooh, that's a good one. I'll give you my personal opinion, and if Brian wants to weigh in, he will as well. Currently, we do not know of any requirements that a company must have auditor involvement, whether it's traditional or it's inline. That did not change as part of the rule. There's a couple questions there. Right now, the current mechanism to have auditor involvement is an AICPA Statement of Position 13-2 in terms of agreed upon procedures over your XBRL tagged financial statements. I can't really say whether we think it should be audited or whether we think it shouldn't be audited. since we play by the rules, and currently the rules say no auditor involvement. It's up to a company to determine what level of procedures they need to do to get comfortable with their XBRL tagging, and that's up to the company at this point.
Okay, great, thank you. And another question, I think this one is covering Brian's section. For hidden tags, how would we handle tagging a sentence like revenue was $2 million for both the 3 months ended 2019 and 2018? We would have to tag 2 million in a hidden area for one of the 2 periods represented.
That's exactly correct. That's exactly how you would handle that type of a situation. You have one of those 2 values that you actually have the text there in your financial statements that you can tag it. And then the other value you would have to include in that hidden section because of the way you've chosen to write that sentence out.
Okay, great, thank you. And another question, are abstract tags still used? Would they be hidden?
Abstract tags would still be used. You wouldn't see them embedded within the HTML document itself. Those would be included in your presentation link base, which is still a requirement.
Okay, thank you. And then just one last kind of set of questions about the inline viewer that seems to be showing an error message. Object found was not a MetaLinks version 2.0 file. And I think that there is a problem with the inline XBRL viewer right now, which is, someone else asked the question, is that the same as the RL viewer? It's the SEC viewer. Are you, Joe and Brian, are you familiar with this problem that's been occurring today?
I personally have no knowledge or insight into that specific question. Okay.
All right, let's move on, and we're going to go to our poll questions. And so this is for those people who are getting CPE. The first poll is up on the screen right now. And it says, in the SEC rule for inline XBRL, large accelerated filers must begin filing using inline XBRL, and here are your options, with their first fiscal period ending on or after June 15th, 2019, or response number 2, with their first fiscal period ending on or after June 15th, 2020, or with their first fiscal period ending on or after June 15th, 2021. This is large accelerated filers. Okay, and you have about 20 seconds more to respond to that. Okay, I'm going to close down that poll, go to our second poll. Okay, and this is, which of the following statements are false as it relates to hidden tags? Okay, option 1, hidden tags should be used to tag data that is required but does not appear in the HTML. Option 2, hidden tags should be used to tag data that is required in a specific format that is inconsistent with the HTML but does not have a transformation available. Number 3, hidden tags should be used to tag data that is required in a specific format that is inconsistent with the HTML and has a transformation available. Or hidden tags should be used to include additional information that is not found in the XBRL file. Okay, and this is, which of these statements is false as it relates to hidden tags? Okay, so just a few more seconds, and I'm gonna pose one more question that came before we move on. Okay, I'm closing down the polling. The question that we received is, okay, you suggested that we file early, but if the filing is not accepted, we would still need to file an amended filing. So what is the benefit of filing early?
So I think the benefit, if you were to file under the voluntary order, or at least go down that path, you would still have the opportunity, if you weren't able, to get the iXBRL filing done, you could revert back to using the traditional XBRL format. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Brian, who's going to continue with his presentation.
And we will continue taking questions later on, so feel free to submit any additional questions. And we'll have 2 more CPE poll questions at the end of this. So back to Brian.
Okay. So next we're going to talk about transformations, which we've alluded to a number of times. So what transformations are is they're basically just rules for converting text that appears in the HTML into a normalized value. Good example of that would be, any written out numbers that you have, such as your 1s, 2s, if you're talking about the number of years, you might have the value of 10 written out as a number. So there are some transformations that are written by both the XBRL specification, and also some additional transformations that were written by the SEC specifically for iXBRL in order to handle these types of situations. So those examples like the 10 years, you're required to report that 10 years in the ISO 8601 format, which is the standard for dates. That value becomes P10Y after that transformation is applied. You don't have any ability to define custom transformations, so you really just need to be aware of the ones that are out there and use them as they're available. So here's an example of what that might look like using the iXBRL viewer on the SEC's website. You can see here where filer had the word no, which really translates to a 0 value for investment securities. So there's a translation out there that exists to convert that word no into the value of 0. So here's a brief example of some of the XBRL specification transformations on the lower left. It's only a few of them. It was quite a long list. And then some of the SEC's specific transformations, you can find these in the Edgar Filer manual. But those are the transformations for your periods of time and your written out numbers. So, the key one here is that second point. Don't put facts that are eligible for transformation into the hidden section. Use these transformations where they're available. The next thing we're going to talk about are continuations and exclusions. So continuations and exclusions are really just related to text block tagging. And what they allow you to do is basically deal with text blocks when you have a disclosure that spans across multiple pages. And what it allows you to do is specifically include or exclude information from that text block, such as header and footer information that you wouldn't necessarily want as part of your filing. So continuations are used to separate 2 blocks of text that overlap, or when text spans multiple pages. Exclusions are used to remove that header and footer information. Similar to the idea with hidden tags here, you don't want to intentionally exclude data that should appear in the filing. So here's an example of what that looks like. I know the shading is a little bit difficult to see, but if you were to pull this up in the live viewer, you'd be able to see that the text block starts at the beginning of the note there, and the shading stops just before we get to that footnote page number at the bottom there. And then it picks up again on the next page, but that footer, that line across the screen in the 7 would be actually excluded from the tagging. So once again, you want to use continuations and exclusions as they were intended. You don't want to use them to intentionally hide information that should be in the filing. You want to develop a process, it could be as simple as just clicking through your text blocks, like we showed on that last slide, and just making sure that you haven't inadvertently excluded a sentence or, part of a paragraph that you intended to actually include in your filing. The next thing we're going to talk about are dimensions. Now, dimensions really haven't changed in any meaningful way when we transition from XBRL to iXBRL. But this is one of those areas that Joe had mentioned earlier, where sometimes the iXBRL viewer is very helpful in terms of allowing you to drill down and filter on things to see them. And dimensions is one area where iXBRL may actually make reviewing access and member information a little bit more difficult. So we're going to show you what that looks like in the iXBRL viewer and how you could achieve that, and also talk about maybe considering sticking with your existing process. So here's an example. where we have a value on the right-hand side that's specific to a business segment here. When you actually click on the value, you can see the axis and segment information. What makes this a little bit difficult to review in the iXBRL viewer is you actually have to click on each value and open up this box to actually see the axis and segment information. The XBRL viewer does have some filtering capabilities that allows you to use the filters, but unfortunately it only goes down to the level of the axis and you can't select specific members. So for example, I wouldn't be able to just highlight the values here that are related to Lennar Home Building, but I can highlight all the values that are related to business segments. So this may be a point of feedback to provide to the SEC on their viewer, that it would be nice if in a future version of it, they might be able to drill down a little bit further to make it easier for filers to review this information. This is a similar idea with dates. You would have to click on each individual value to see the dates, but once again, there is a date filter available so that you can highlight values that all pertain to the same date. Here's an example of a traditional XBRL rendering. So same date or same set of data points here, but what you can see is, in reviewing this, if I wanted to look at the values for Lennar Home Building, I can see that they're all in those first two columns there by nature of the way it's rendered in this document. And similarly, the Rialto business segment, I can see that that's the next set of two columns to the right. So here's just two examples of ways you could review this information using the new iXBRL viewer, and how you may want to consider maybe leveraging your existing process or speak to your vendor about using a traditional XBRL rendering to review this information. The next thing we're going to talk about is signs. So signs have always been a major topic of discussion for the SEC and for filers, understanding whether we need to input a value as a positive or a negative in order to achieve the ultimate debit or credit balance. As far as the guidance around determining whether something needs to be a positive or a negative, and nothing has really changed there. But the way we deal with that in iXBRL is a little bit different. We have a new attribute called a sign attribute that we need to assign to the value. There's really no magic bullet for this one either. You really want to talk to your vendor about how they handle it. Some vendors may advise you to include the negative or the brackets when you tag the value, and their software will handle it behind the scenes. But other software may not do that, and you may need to just tag the value and then assign the sign attribute to a negative. So what might that look like? On the left-hand side is the actual, what you would see in the XBRL coding. Now, certainly we wouldn't expect filers to be looking at the XBRL coding behind the scenes, but just so that you can visualize what it looks like, you see this value of $30 million here is actually a negative value because the sign attribute has been set to a negative, even though it appears as a positive amount in the financial statements. So that wraps up the section on the the different nuances and features of iXBRL. Some suggestions and thoughts for managing quality here is within your planning process, begin your discussions with your service provider early. If you are in that large accelerated filer group, you should be probably engaging in those discussions here towards the end of Q1 because you will have to comply with the new rules by the Q2 filing. And you should develop your timeline to transition based off of the deadline for your filer category, and consider doing that trial run by submitting the iXBRL under the voluntary order, and have a contingency plan in the event that there's some challenges that you didn't foresee. Be prepared to file in the traditional XBRL format if you are planning to file under that voluntary order. There are a number of companies who have chosen to do this, which is where we drew some of these examples from. You're permitted to file ahead of time before your deadline. You should also allow for some extra time to educate your staff and consider the new processes that might need to be developed. For example, reviewing those hidden sections and any changes that you might need to make as far as reviewing signs or any of the other topics that we mentioned. So in terms of considering those processes, think about how you're going to review for completeness of the iXBRL filing. Because you're going to have the tags embedded within the HTML, in theory, completeness should be simpler to achieve by looking at that iXBRL rendering. You may also want to think about, in terms of your tagging process and selecting the correct taxonomy element. The iXBRL viewer has a feature that allows you to actually search for specific accounting pronouncements and see which tags are associated with them. So you may want to consider looking at the taxonomy and the specific tags that you're using related to an accounting pronouncement to make sure you're leveraging those standard IFRS or US GAAP tags. You may want to consider updating or developing a checklist if you don't have one already to include any of these new process steps like the hidden tags or the transformations to make sure that you have a process in place to address those. As we mentioned, there are certain things such as the dates and the access and member information that you may want to consider whether you're going to leverage your existing process or leverage the iXBRL viewer to review those items. There's some other areas and things that we didn't specifically cover that are available in those filters. You can filter by balance attribute, the specific decimal attribute, so that you can actually highlight and underline the values on your HTML document that all have the same decimal attribute. So it's just another means for you to be able to review that information throughout the filing. And then the last point on here, are you currently using the Data Quality Committee rules? So XBRL US has developed a number of rules that you can run on your filing before you submit it. They're not validation errors that would necessarily get your filing stripped, but they are business rules that if you have, you shouldn't have certain values that are negative, for example, or that if you have two values, that a third value should be the sum of those two. So make sure you're considering those. Talk to your vendor about whether or not they're incorporated within their tool, or if there's another means for you to be able to review those rules. All right, Michelle, I will turn it back over to you. Michelle, are you there?
Michelle, I think you're on mute. Yep. Thanks, Brian. Michelle's just written to me to let me know that she's lost her console. So we're going to go ahead and do the next two polling questions. I think that's what the agenda calls for.
Yeah, and David, I apologize. I'm back. Oh. Sorry about that. Momentary blip there, but I am back. And let me just go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. So sorry about that. Just got lost in the shuffle of all the stuff on my screen here. So yes, we're going to take two more poll questions. Okay. And these are obviously related to what Brian has just been covering. So hopefully you should see this on your screen now. And the first question is, of the 4 types of duplicates that could appear in a filing, which type is not permissible according to the Edgar Filer Manual and will automatically cause your filing to be rejected? Is it complete duplicates, inconsistent duplicates, consistent duplicates, or multi-language duplicates? Which one will cause your filing to be rejected? Okay, we've got about another 30 seconds here. We have a few more questions also that are coming in from the audience. Okay, I'm going to end this polling now. Last chance. Okay, and let's go to our last poll. Which of the following is not a reason to use continuations or exclusions? Option 1, to combine non-continuous blocks of text into a single block of text, to exclude specific text from a block of text, such as headers and footers. Option 3, to tag overlapping blocks of text, or option 4, to exclude specific text from a block of text, such as a significant accounting policy. Which of those is not a reason to use a continuation or an exclusion? Okay, about another 20 seconds for that. And then we do have a couple of questions. Okay, just 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm shutting down the polling right now. Okay. Okay, so some questions for Brian and Joe. Do you know of an example that shows a number that has more than one tags in the new inline viewer? We would like to see what that would look like. For example, ABC and XYZ had 5 million in cash at December 31st, 2018. So the 5 million would need to be tagged twice with ABC and with XYZ.
So I don't have a specific example I can show you offhand, but that example would be very similar to the one that was mentioned earlier, where you have the same value for 2 different reporting periods. In a similar fashion, you would use the value that's actually presented in the HTML as one of those facts, and you would tag that with ABC company, and then you would create a hidden fact to tag the XYZ company in the hidden section.
Okay, thank you, Brian. The next question, I'm not sure I quite understand this, is will traditional ways of viewing XBRL persist in PDF files? I think it's PD, they indicated PDS, but I think it may have been PDF files after inline XBRL is formally adopted. This includes rendered XBRL and financial report.xls.
If I could take a shot at that one, I'm not sure that it actually makes a difference. The XBRL that we look at is basically manufactured for human consumption. The overall intent for XBRL is to have an electronic format that is machine readable that can then analyze and interpret what the data is. So anything that we do, whether it's exporting it to an Excel spreadsheet, or exporting it to a PDF file and having it underlined or something, or in some way exporting it to some type of file where you might have, a sidebar with some of the facts in it. Those are all, if you want to call it a vendor or consumer specific tool that allows you to see the information that's embedded. When you get your XHTML file, be it something you download from the SEC website or from, some other service, you're going to have the ability to open that either in a traditional viewer or an iXBRL viewer, and then either mouse over those highlighted or tagged facts or not. Anything else that we see is, I think, going to be, developed by third parties to meet specific needs. So you should always end up with several different formats that are available to read the data in. But we need to kind of understand that it's really for machine consumption, not for human consumption, matched by aggregators who will then have different sorts and filters and downloadable modules that you can look at different things in and how you can run queries. So hope that answered it.
Thank you. And I did get a clarification in that PDS means public dissemination service. So that's the XBRL filings that are disseminated, the filings that are disseminated to various data aggregators that get them from the SEC. And I believe that will continue as it does today. Okay, I think those. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
I would expect that wouldn't change in any meaningful way because the iXBRL document still produces that traditional XBRL document. So whatever method they have for releasing that information now, I would imagine shouldn't change too much.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. And I want to especially thank Joe Luchka from KPMG and Brian Castrantis from Richie May for giving a great, really informative presentation. And I also want to let you know that we have some additional presentations coming up as part of our Inline XBRL series. On April 3rd, we're going to have Inline XBRL Deep Dive, exploring workflow changes for filers and vendors. And on May 1st, we have Inline XBRL Deep Dive, navigating the instance document. So those will be kind of more intensive programs, looking a little bit deeper into these particular issues. Today's was a bit of an overview, although I think there was a lot of really detailed and useful information. We will be sending out a link to the replay and also to the slides themselves. I know that was a question that came in, and we'll be sending that out probably tomorrow. So thanks again, and we hope to see you in April at our next event. Thank you.